U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening a 25% tariff on Canadian goods. That adds up to about $26 million a day to the cost of oil exported to the United States, our biggest trading partner. This would be quite the hit to the Canadian economy. Now, to chat about this in more detail, and the gentleman who worked the numbers out for us is Sun political columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us from Toronto. Brian, there's a lot of chatter about how Canada could potentially retaliate, but you say that we can actually avoid these tariffs if we act properly. Can you explain?
Well, Donald Trump has said you have to fix the border or face 25% tariffs on all goods. And the immediate reaction of some Canadians is, well, there's no problem with our border. It's the Mexican border that's the problem. But then you look at the numbers and you say, well, actually, we're becoming a problem. And Tom Homan, who's the new incoming border czar, we talked about him before. He's the guy from Western New York, grew up just south of Kingston, still calls that home. He's had moved back there, and the president's called him to go to Washington. He knows the problems on the southern border, or sorry, well, our southern border, their northern border. He knows the problems about people smuggling, drug smuggling in places like the Thousand Islands near Kingston, about Roxham Road, about the vast 49th parallel, where, yes, you can easily smuggle things across, and he wants them addressed. He has called the Canada-US border a national security threat. He's the guy with Trump's ear. He's saying it, Trump saying, okay, fix the border or you can face these tariffs. I looked at the numbers, Hal. We've had an 82% increase over the last 2 years in the number of people encountered by US Customs and Border Protection Service at the Canadian border. 198,000 people now, an 82% increase from just 2 years ago. Now, that's small compared to Mexico, where it's 2.1 million. We're only about 9.3% of the total land border interceptions or encounters. But what that means is we've got a lot of people coming from Canada and going to the US, either trying to enter illegally or, in many cases, showing up and they declare asylum. I'll give you an example. 46,000 Indian nationals. So they're not Canadian citizens, they're not permanent residents, they're Indian nationals who've come here on a visitor visa, on a temporary foreign workers visa, on a student visa. And then they go down to the States. 46,000. That's a small city. 36,000 of them, by the way, are single unattached adults, mostly males. China's the next biggest with 12,000. That's an issue for the Americans when our interceptions are going up, Mexico's are going down. Twice as many people deemed to be on the terror watch list are caught trying to cross the Canada-US border than the US-Mexico border. These are issues that the Americans want addressed, and we need to address them. On the drugs issue, he specifically mentioned fentanyl. We're not a major fentanyl producer, but there was that story about the super lab in BC just a couple of weeks ago. He will definitely have seen that. We've got to make sure he also sees stories like the big bust in October with the former Canadian snowboarder at the center of it. That was a drug transaction network that spread from Mexico to California to the US Midwest to Alberta to Ontario. We've got to show that we will work with them on drug issues, but we really need to get our immigration system under control to deal with the fact that so many people are using Canada as a backdoor to the US.
Now, our premier here in Alberta, Daniel Smith, has gone on record, Brian, saying that Americans have legitimate concerns. I know you were recently with Ontario Premier Doug Ford, and you've also been speaking with Pierre Poilievre's team. What are other leaders saying in this regard?
Similar things. Ontario Premier Doug Ford was not as forceful in saying the American concerns are legitimate, but he held a news conference. I got a couple of questions to him and said, look, 198,000 people, is that worrisome? He said, yeah, we need to address it. He said, but we also have illegal goods coming in from the States. We have people coming into Canada illegally. We've got to work together. Premier Ford is currently the chair of the Council of the Federation. In fact, Premier Smith is going to be coming to Toronto in about 2.5 weeks' time for a big conference there and then speaking here. Well, as chair of that council, Premier Ford was on the phone with all the premiers last night and with the prime minister after he had spoken to President-elect Trump and said, look, we need a first ministers meeting. So that's taking place Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pierre Poilievre, he's come out and said, let's take a Team Canada approach, but here's what you have to do. And he said that you've got to address the Americans' concerns. And he added in not just the ones that Trump mentioned, but said, look, successive American administrations have been calling on Canada to increase defense spending, and it's not happening. You've got to look after their valid concerns with us, or we're going to be punished.
Now, let's circle back to the meeting that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has with the premiers coming up this week, Brian. Do you get the sense that the Trudeau government takes the issue when it comes to immigration seriously with the incoming Trump administration and maybe react accordingly? Or will he maybe mishandle this and put our economy at serious risk?
I'm worried that it's the latter. I listened to the Prime Minister at a scrum today, and he kept talking about, well, we've got to explain the facts to them, meaning the facts about trade. And I've described it this way to a few people. The Americans are upset at us about the border. And if we turn around, and they're threatening tariffs, which would hurt the economy. If we turn around and our answer to them is, well, but we do so much trade, this will hurt your people, this will hurt your jobs, they're going to say, we don't care. It's like when your wife is angry at you because you keep leaving your socks on the couch, and she raises it with you and says, stop leaving the socks on the couch. And you say, but honey, the garage is so clean. You're answering with something she's not upset about. And that's what Trudeau sounds like he is doing. Melanie Joly was a bit better in a news conference, but this is also a government that broke the immigration system. It took them almost a year to realize how badly they had messed it up. And now they're saying, we've got over 7% of our population are temporary residents, students and temporary foreign workers. And millions of them are coming up for the time to leave. Their time is done. We have no way of dealing with that. And what are we learning now? Tens of thousands of them are going to the United States and declaring asylum, which plugs up their system. I'm not sure that they have the wherewithal. If they do it right, if they take it seriously, then they can. Will they do the work? I just have my doubts.
And Brian just reminded me of some socks to pick up when I get home here. Now, fixing our immigration system, which seems to be a big part of the irritants for the Americans, as you just discussed, would also benefit Canada. Now, you recently wrote about just how broken our system is, in particular for refugees, and how it's costing Canadian taxpayers billions upon billions of dollars. Can you explain?
So there was a story that came out last week that the federal interim health program, I believe that's what it's called. This is the program to provide healthcare for asylum seekers, refugee claimants. It used to cost in 2016 about $60 million. It's now set to cost $411 million. And people were shocked. And I said, well, hold on a minute. That's just part of the equation. I looked at what the province of Ontario spends. Now, the numbers will be different because Ontario and Quebec get the lion's share of asylum seekers, but you can check in municipal budgets and provincial budgets across Alberta, and you'll find similar increases. But I'll give you the Ontario numbers I have. The province of Ontario spent $1 billion last year on different programs for asylum seekers that the feds have let in. So that's $1 billion to the province. 1 out of 4 people in Ontario on the welfare system are refugee claimants. 1 in 4. 60% of the shelter beds in Toronto and in Ottawa are taken up by refugee claimants. Things are so bad that Francois Legault, Quebec's premier, has said we can't afford another Roxham Road. He's talking about the cost in the school system, in the health system, to his province. He sent their provincial police down to the border to start patrolling it. I'm not sure what jurisdiction they have, but if it stops people from going in both directions, maybe that's a good thing and deals with the Trump issue. But at every level, this is costing municipal governments, provincial governments, and federal governments. And again, Justin Trudeau has not been willing to fix it. He's broken the permanent resident portion of the immigration system. He's broken the temporary residents, and he's broken the refugee system, which is up dramatically, not with people who are fleeing war, but people who want a better life for themselves. I don't blame them, but they're economic migrants coming in, declaring asylum, and then it's almost 4 years before a case is heard. That's 4 years of people being on public assistance. It's not a good way to run the system.
Brian, a NATO meeting in Montreal this week drew a lot of negative attention for Canada. I mean, on one hand, over the protests, and the other for lack of defense spending. Do you think this maybe gave Canada a bit of a black eye in Montreal?
Yeah, and especially in the United States, where both of these things were noticed, eh, the anti-Semitic protest. I mean, a bunch of the media outlets that covered it called it an anti-NATO protest, and that was the Canadian press. And look, it wasn't a conspiracy among media outlets. A lot of us subscribe to Canadian press, but their headline called it an anti-NATO protest. People were going around making Nazi salutes and saying the final solution is coming for you towards Jewish Montrealers, significant Jewish population in Montreal. They were chanting for the Intifada, only one solution, Intifada revolution. And genocidal chants like that being sung as they smash windows, burn cars, run rampant through Montreal. And what was our PM doing? He was dancing at the Taylor Swift concert. That all got picked up by American media. And there were, this is the NATO Parliamentary Association meetings. Um, they were talking about the fact that Canada doesn't spend enough on defense, including top Americans on the Republican side who are about to become more powerful. The Democrats have been complaining about us not spending enough for years. The Trump guys are going to complain louder. And like the border issue, maybe Trump turns around and says, more tariffs if you don't increase defense spending. Or Canadian companies are allowed to sell to the American military. It's very lucrative for our businesses. Maybe he turns around and says, you know what? You're not pulling your weight. We're getting rid of that. We're going to face an awful lot of problems that I'm not saying we deserve this, but there are problems that we have self-generated by failing to do the hard work of governing. The Trudeau government is a government that likes to do press releases and announcements. They don't like to do the hard work of governing the way the Harper government did, the Martin government, the Chrétien government did. You could disagree with their policies, but they focused on governing. These guys focus on optics and going to Taylor Swift concerts.
So, Brian, let's talk a bit about some of these protests, which seem to be getting more and more violent lately, all across North America, including in our major centers like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. Where are we dropping the ball? Is the municipalities working with the police? Is the province? Is the federal government? What are you seeing right now?
Well, I don't think that you're getting protests quite as bad out in Calgary or Edmonton. And in fact, the universities in those two cities quickly cleared out an attempt to set up encampments. Uh, we have not had that in Toronto or Montreal because of weak leadership. University of Toronto had incredibly weak leadership. Uh, the police forces in Toronto and Montreal have dropped the ball repeatedly, Toronto specifically, because of weak leadership from the chief who takes instruction from the mayor. I know politicians love to say that they don't direct police, but believe me, they do. The police know which side their bread is buttered on. And they also know that if, in the case of Toronto, if they were to crack down, they would not get political backing for the crackdown from someone like Mayor Olivia Chow, who has said, those crazies voted for me. So, this is not something that we should be dealing with, but unfortunately we are. You had a rabbi who was told to get away from a protest because he was disturbing the peace. You're an identifiable Jew. We ask you to leave. Why?
Wow.
So you can protect the pro-terrorists mob that's walking through the streets of Montreal? Apparently, that's what the Montreal police decided.
Wow. Brian, on another note, a group of healthcare workers in Ontario have filed a class action lawsuit over vaccine mandates. Now, you've been following this story fairly closely. Do you think they'll be successful?
Based on what's happened with other court cases and arbitrations, I I don't think so. If you had asked me pre-pandemic, I would have said yes, because the Ontario Nurses Association fought against mandatory flu shots and mandatory masks prior to the pandemic, and they won. And that's why it was always puzzling to me that organizations like nurses associations, by the way, nurses associations across Canada had done that pre-pandemic, and then we all lost our minds during COVID and lost our sense of where the state should end and you begin, and agreed that mandates had to be everywhere. So there have been several arbitration decisions on people that lost their jobs. That's not exactly the same as a civil suit. The standards are different, but they've all lost, and I've seen other court cases where they've lost. So we'll have to wait and see. But also in this one, I think the target is wrong. They're suing the province and the provincial chief medical officer. The province is not the employer, and all the province said in Ontario's case was you have to have a policy on vaccination. They didn't tell them that you have to have a policy of mandatory vaccination or lose your jobs. They just said, come up with a policy on it. Some hospitals demanded vaccination, others did not. And so I think that makes this lawsuit difficult to cross the finish line.
And Brian, for a lot of our viewers who enjoy our Q&As here on Bridge City News and especially on our YouTube channel, you're taking a bit of a break going on a Caribbean cruise. So we're not going to chat with you on December 3rd to the 10th. You're back, what, on the 17th, I believe?
17th, and I'll be attending a lunch with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith to hear what she has to say about the need for Alberta's energy sector for a healthy Canada. But by the way, I got to say, being inundated with those ads here in Ontario, I'm sure you're not seeing them in Alberta because that'd be a waste of money, but they're being shown in news programs, big sporting events. They're everywhere here, both from the province and companies like Synovus.
It's amazing. Looking forward to our next Q&A, Brian, and safe travels. Enjoy your trip here.
Thank you.